The pickup truck sputtered to a stop in a cloud of dust and desperation, its engine giving one final wheeze before falling silent. From behind the steering wheel, Emma Chen stared at the sprawling ranch before her, her knuckles white against the cracked leather as doubt crashed over her like a wave. In the back seat, 3-year-old Mason's wails had reached a crescendo that could probably be heard in the next county, while beside him a prize bull calf she'd named Theodore bellowed his own complaints about the long journey. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This wasn't exactly how she'd pictured arriving at Riverside Ranch. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Montana landscape, painting everything in shades of gold and amber that would have been breathtaking under different circumstances. But Emma's attention was split between the crying child in her back seat, the increasingly agitated calf, and the imposing figure she could see emerging from the main barn. Even from a distance, she could tell this man commanded respect. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the confident stride of someone who'd never questioned his place in the world. Everything about him screamed authority, from his worn Stetson pulled low against the morning sun, to the way his presence seemed to calm the horses that nickered softly as he passed their paddock. This had to be Jake Morrison, the ranch foreman she'd spoken with on the phone 3 days ago. The conversation that had changed everything. Emma's hands trembled as she turned off the ignition, the silence that followed somehow more overwhelming than the noise had been. Mason's cries subsided to hiccups and sniffles, his chubby face red and tear-streaked as he rubbed his eyes with tiny fists. She'd been driving for 16 hours straight, stopping only for gas and the necessities, pushing herself and Mason through state after state as she fled the wreckage of her old life. The bull calf, Theodore, shifted restlessly in the makeshift pen she'd constructed in the truck bed, his dark eyes reflecting the same uncertainty that churned in Emma's stomach. At 4 months old, he was already showing the promise that had made him worth every penny of her divorce settlement. Champion bloodlines, perfect conformation, and a temperament that had won over even the most skeptical cattle judges. He was her future, her investment in a dream that felt more fragile with each passing mile. Jake Morrison's boots crunched against the gravel as he approached, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. Emma forced herself to step out of the truck, her legs unsteady after so many hours behind the wheel. She was acutely aware of how she must look: rumpled clothes, coffee-stained shirt, hair escaping from what had once been a neat ponytail. Not exactly the professional image she'd hoped to project. "Miss Chen?" Jake's voice was deep, measured, with just a hint of curiosity. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, weathered from years under the Montana sun, and the way his gaze took in every detail of her situation, with the practiced assessment of a man accustomed to solving problems. "That's me," Emma managed, summoning what was left of her composure. "Though I probably don't look much like the person you spoke with on the phone." Jake's attention shifted to the truck, where Mason had pressed his face against the window, leaving little handprints on the glass as he stared out with the wide-eyed wonder that only toddlers possessed. The bull calf chose that moment to let out another bellow, a sound that seemed to echo across the entire ranch. "And you brought company," Jake observed, though his tone gave nothing away. Emma felt heat rise to her cheeks. This wasn't how she'd planned to introduce herself to her new employer. When she'd called about the livestock specialist position, she'd mentioned her qualifications, her experience with cattle breeding, her knowledge of nutrition and genetics. She hadn't mentioned Mason, or Theodore, or the fact that her entire life could fit into the back of a 10-year-old pickup truck. "I can explain," she began, but Jake was already moving toward the truck bed, his movements careful and deliberate as he approached Theodore. The bull calf, despite his youth, was no small animal. At 4 months old, he already weighed close to 300 pounds, his black coat gleaming in the morning light. Emma watched nervously as Jake extended his hand, allowing Theodore to catch his scent before making contact. It was the approach of someone who understood cattle, who respected their nature and intelligence. "Angus," Jake said, running his palm along Theodore's flank. "Good conformation. Strong hindquarters." He paused, his experienced eye taking in details that most people would miss. "This isn't just any calf." "Theodore," Emma said, unable to keep the pride from her voice despite her nervousness. His sire was grand champion at the National Western Stock Show 3 years running. His dam's bloodline traces back to some of the finest breeding stock in the country. Jake's eyebrows rose slightly. Theodore's an expensive traveling companion for someone looking for work. The observation hit closer to home than Emma cared to admit. Theodore represented everything she had left, every hope for building something new. When her marriage had imploded, when David had shown his true colors, she'd fought tooth and nail for custody of Mason and ownership of Theodore. The calf had been her project, her passion, purchased with money she'd earned from consulting work that David had always dismissed as a hobby. "He's my investment in the future," Emma said simply. "Mine and Mason's." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Mason chose that moment to push open the truck door, his little legs swinging as he tried to climb down from the seat that was still too high for him. Emma rushed to help, lifting him down and immediately feeling the sticky warmth of his small hand in hers. "Mama, I have to go potty," Mason announced with the brutal honesty of a 3-year-old, his voice carrying across the ranch yard. Emma closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of exhaustion and embarrassment crash over her. This wasn't how professional meetings were supposed to go. She was supposed to be composed, confident, ready to prove that she was exactly what Riverside Ranch needed. Instead, she was standing in the dust with a crying child, a restless bull calf, and the growing certainty that she'd made a terrible mistake. "The main house has facilities," Jake said quietly, his voice gentler than she'd expected. "Maria's probably got coffee on too if you've been driving all night." Emma looked up at him, searching his weathered features for any sign of judgment or dismissal. Instead, she found something that might have been understanding, tempered with the caution of a man who'd learned not to jump to conclusions. "I don't want to impose," Emma began, but Jake was already walking toward the house, his long strides eating up the distance. "Maria Gonzalez," he called over his shoulder. "She runs the household, keeps us all in line. Fair warning. She's going to want to feed you whether you're hungry or not." Emma fell into step beside him, Mason's hand still clutched in hers while Theodore's bellowing continued from the truck behind them. The main house was a sprawling log structure that seemed to grow organically from the landscape, its wide porches and weathered wood. Speaking of generations of Morrison family history. As they climbed the front steps, the doors swung open to reveal a woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Maria Gonzalez had the bearing of someone accustomed to running a household full of stubborn men and unpredictable animals, and Emma could see why Jake spoke of her with such obvious respect. "Dios mío!" Maria exclaimed, her gaze moving from Emma's travel-worn appearance to Mason's tear-streaked face, to the sound of Theodore's complaints carrying from the truck. "Jake Morrison, you didn't tell me we were expecting a family." "It's complicated," Jake said, removing his hat as they entered the house. "Ms. Chen, this is Maria." "Maria, this is Emma Chen, the livestock specialist we discussed." Maria's expression shifted to one of warm welcome mixed with concern. "Livestock specialist with a baby and a—" She paused, listening to Theodore's continued protests. "What exactly is making that noise?" "A bull calf," Emma said, feeling heat rise to her cheeks again. "I know this isn't what you were expecting. I can find somewhere else to stay, somewhere to board Theodore. I just needed—" "Potty!" Mason interrupted urgently, tugging on Emma's hand with the determination of a child who'd reached his limit. "Down the hall, second door on the right," Maria said immediately, already moving toward them. "I'll show you, Mijo." As Maria led Mason away, chattering to him in a mixture of English and Spanish that seemed to calm him instantly, Emma found herself alone with Jake in the spacious living room. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of explanations she wasn't sure she was ready to give. "You want to tell me what's really going on here?" Jake asked, settling into a worn leather chair that had clearly been his father's before him. His tone wasn't unkind, but it carried the authority of a man who'd built his reputation on street dealing and honest communication. Emma sank into the chair across from him, feeling the exhaustion of the past week settle into her bones. Where could she even begin? With David's betrayal? With the custody battle? With the way her carefully planned life had collapsed like a house of cards in a windstorm? "I was married," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "to another cattle rancher in Colorado, David Chen. We had a operation focused on breeding stock, genetic improvement, nutrition optimization." Jake nodded, encouraging her to continue. "I thought we were partners," Emma went on, the words coming easier now that she'd started. In business, in life, in raising Mason, I handled the breeding programs, the genetic testing, the nutrition protocols. David managed the business side, the sales, the contracts. She paused, still unable to believe how naive she'd been. Turns out, David had been managing more than just business. He'd been having an affair with his accountant for 2 years. When I found out, when I confronted him, he told me I was welcome to take my hobby projects and leave. Said real ranching was men's work anyway. Jake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he remained silent, letting her tell her story at her own pace. The divorce was ugly, Emma continued. David tried to claim that everything was his, including Mason. Said I was an unfit mother because I cared more about cattle than my own child. Her voice cracked slightly. That wasn't true. It was never true. But fighting him in court, proving that I was capable of providing for Mason on my own. You took what you could and ran. Jake finished quietly. Emma nodded. Theodore was legally mine. I documented everything, kept meticulous records. The breeding rights, the bloodline certifications, all of it. David couldn't touch him legally, but he made it clear that staying in Colorado wasn't an option. So when I saw your posting online, when you said you needed someone with experience in cattle genetics and breeding programs. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You didn't mention the child, Jake pointed out, though his tone remained neutral. I know, Emma said, meeting his gaze directly. I know how it looks. Single mother, traveling with a toddler and a valuable animal. Probably desperate enough to take any job offered. But I'm good at what I do, Jake. I have degrees in animal science and genetics. I've improved breeding outcomes by 30% on every operation I've consulted for. I can increase your calf survival rates, optimize your feed efficiency, and develop breeding protocols that will have your cattle bringing top dollar at market. Jake studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. And Theodore? Theodore is my insurance policy, Emma said honestly. His genetics are worth more than anything else I own. With the right breeding program, he could be the foundation of something special. I'm not asking for charity, Jake. I'm asking for a chance to prove that I'm worth the risk. Before Jake could respond, the sound of small feet running down the hallway announced Mason's return, closely followed by Maria carrying a plate of fresh cookies and wearing the satisfied expression of a woman who'd successfully fed a hungry child. Mama, the nice lady gave me cookies, Mason announced, chocolate already smeared around his mouth as he climbed into Emma's lap. Just one, Maria said firmly, though her eyes were twinkling. Before lunch spoils his appetite. Emma hugged Mason close, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo and feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders. Whatever happened next, at least they were safe. At least they were together. Theodore's getting antsy out there, Jake observed, standing and moving toward the window. That truck bed's not going to hold him much longer. Emma felt her heart sink. This was it then. The polite dismissal, the suggestion that she might be happier somewhere else, somewhere more suited to her situation. We've got a holding pen near the barn, Jake continued, surprising her. Temporary, but it'll give him room to move around while we figure out what comes next. Emma blinked, certain she'd misheard. What comes next? Jake turned from the window, his expression serious but not unkind. I called 3 references yesterday after we spoke. Dr. Patricia Williams at Colorado State University had some very interesting things to say about your work. So did Tom Bradley from the Triple Creek Ranch. Emma's breath caught. She remembered Dr. Williams, her advisor during graduate school, and Tom Bradley, whose operation she'd consulted for during her early career. Both had been mentors, supporters of her work when others in the field had questioned a young woman's ability to understand cattle breeding. Dr. Williams said you had the best instincts for cattle genetics she'd seen in 20 years of teaching, Jake continued. Said you could read bloodlines like most people read newspapers. Tom Bradley told me you'd increased his operations efficiency by 40% in 6 months. They said that? Emma whispered, hardly daring to believe it. They also said you'd been through a rough divorce, that your ex-husband had tried to discredit your work and your abilities. Jake's voice hardened slightly. Dr. Williams was particularly clear about what she thought of men who try to diminish women's accomplishments. Maria made a sound of agreement from where she stood near the kitchen, and Emma realized the older woman had been listening to every word. "So here's what I'm thinking," Jake said, settling back into his chair. "Riverside Ranch has been operating the same way for 3 generations. Same breeding practices, same feed protocols, same everything. We do well enough, but we're not growing, not improving. Maybe it's time for some new ideas." Emma's heart began to beat faster, hope and anxiety warring in her chest. "The job comes with housing," Jake continued. "There's a foreman's cottage about a quarter-mile from here that's been sitting empty since my last specialist moved to Texas. 2 bedrooms, kitchen, living area. Nothing fancy, but it's clean and private." "And Theodore?" Emma asked, hardly daring to breathe. "We've got facilities that can accommodate him," Jake said. In fact, having access to his bloodlines might be exactly what this ranch needs to take the next step forward. Emma felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. After weeks of rejection, of being told she was asking for too much, expecting too much, someone was actually willing to take a chance on her. "There are conditions," Jake added, his tone becoming more formal. "This is a working ranch, not a daycare. I can't have operations disrupted by childcare issues." Emma's heart sank. Of course there would be conditions. There were always conditions. "However," Jake continued, and Emma caught a hint of something that might have been amusement in his voice. "Maria's been complaining for years that this place is too quiet, too full of stubborn men who don't appreciate good cooking or proper conversation." Maria snorted from the kitchen. "Stubborn men who track mud on my clean floors and think beans from a can count as a proper meal. Mason seems like a well-behaved child," Jake observed, watching as the toddler played quietly with a wooden toy horse he'd found on the coffee table. "But ranch life comes with rules. Safety rules, behavior rules, respect for the animals and the work." "I understand," Emma said quickly. "Mason's a good boy. He listens, and he loves animals. I can make sure he doesn't interfere with operations." "I'm not worried about interference," Jake said, and this time Emma was certain she heard amusement in his voice. "I'm thinking more about integration. This ranch has always been about family, about teaching the next generation what it means to care for the land and the animals. Maybe it's time we had some young energy around here again." Emma stared at him, hardly able to process what she was hearing. Not only was he offering her the job, but he was suggesting that Mason would be welcome, that he could be part of the ranch community rather than a burden to be managed. "Are you offering me the position?" she asked, her voice barely steady. "I'm offering you a trial period," Jake corrected. 30 days to prove that you and your ideas can make a difference here. Show me that Theodore's genetics can improve our breeding program. Show me that your methods can increase our efficiency. And show me that a single mother with a 3-year-old and a prize bull calf can fit into the rhythm of ranch life." Emma's throat tightened with emotion. It wasn't everything she'd hoped for, but it was more than she'd dared to expect. A chance. A real chance to prove herself, to build something for Mason's future. "And if I don't meet your expectations?" she asked. Jake's expression grew serious. "Then we'll part ways professionally, but we'll make sure you and Mason have somewhere safe to go next. I don't leave families stranded, Miss Chen. That's not how we do things here." Emma looked down at Mason, who had abandoned the toy horse in favor of trying to reach a cookie crumb that had fallen on the floor. Her son, her responsibility, her reason for fighting so hard to build a better life. Then she looked back at Jake, this man who was offering them both a chance at something she thought was lost forever. "When do we start?" she asked. Jake's smile was slow but genuine. "How about we start by getting Theodore settled, then I'll show you around the operation. But first, Maria's going to insist on feeding you both a proper meal." "Por supuesto," Maria called from the kitchen. "You're nothing but skin and bones, mija. And this little one needs proper food in his belly." As if summoned by the mention of food, Mason perked up, abandoning his pursuit of cookie crumbs to look hopefully toward the kitchen. "Lunch, Mama?" he asked, his earlier tears completely forgotten. "Lunch?" Emma confirmed, lifting him into her arms and feeling, for the first time in months, like maybe everything was going to be okay. Jake stood, settling his hat back on his head. "I'll go get some of the hands to help move Theodore to the holding pen. Give you time to eat, maybe clean up a bit before we start the tour." As he headed toward the door, Emma found her voice again. "Jake?" He paused, turning back to look at her. "Thank you," she said simply, "for taking a chance on us." Jake touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that somehow managed to be both formal and intimate. "Welcome to Riverside Ranch, Emma. Let's see what kind of magic you and Theodore can work around here." After Jake left, Emma found herself in Maria's capable hands, being ushered toward the kitchen while Mason explored the living room under the older woman's watchful eye. The kitchen was warm and inviting, filled with the sense of fresh bread and simmering soup, and lined with windows that looked out over the ranch's sprawling grounds. "Sit," Maria commanded, pointing to a chair at the large wooden table that dominated the space. "You look like you haven't had a proper meal in days." Emma wanted to protest, to maintain some semblance of professional dignity, but the truth was that Maria was right. The past week had been a blur of fast food and convenience store snacks, eaten on the run between packing, legal meetings, and the endless drive across 3 states. "I don't want to impose," Emma began, but Maria waved her objections away with a wooden spoon. "In this house, food is love," Maria said firmly. "And you, Mija, look like you could use both." As Maria bustled around the kitchen, preparing plates and chattering about the ranch, the weather, and her opinions on men who thought they could survive on coffee and stubbornness alone, Emma felt something inside her begin to relax for the first time in months. There was something deeply comforting about being cared for, about being treated not as a charity case or a problem to be solved, but simply as a person who needed sustenance and kindness. Mason had discovered a basket of toys near the window, clearly kept for visiting children, and was happily arranging wooden animals in elaborate patterns while humming tunelessly to himself. Watching him, Emma felt a pang of guilt for all the upheaval she'd put him through, all the uncertainty and stress that had marked the past months of their lives. "He's a good boy," Maria observed, following Emma's gaze. "Well behaved. You've done well with him, especially considering—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Emma understood. Especially considering the divorce, the fighting, the way David had tried to use Mason as a weapon in their battle. Especially considering that Emma had been essentially a single parent even before the marriage ended, managing most of Mason's care while David focused on business and, as it turned out, his affair. "He's resilient," Emma said, accepting a steaming bowl of soup that smelled like heaven. "More resilient than I am sometimes." "Children often are," Maria agreed, settling into the chair across from her with her own bowl. "They adapt, they find joy in small things, they trust that the adults in their lives will take care of them. It's both a blessing and a responsibility." Emma nodded, taking her first spoonful of soup and nearly sighing with pleasure. It was rich and hearty, filled with vegetables and tender beef, the kind of meal that spoke of patience and care in its preparation. "Jake's a good man," Maria said quietly, her tone carrying the weight of years of observation. "Fair, honest, stubborn as a mule when he thinks he's right, but he's also lonely, though he'd never admit it." Emma looked up, surprised by the personal observation. "His father died 2 years ago," Maria continued. "Left him this ranch, all the responsibility, all the history. Jake's thrown himself into the work, into making sure everything runs perfectly, but he's forgotten that a ranch isn't just about cattle and land. It's about community, about family, about the next generation." "He seems very dedicated," Emma said carefully, not sure how to respond to such personal information about her new employer. "Dedicated, yes, but also isolated," Maria sighed. "Too many women in town see him as a prize to be won, a successful rancher with land and money. They don't see the man who sits on the porch at night, looking out over the hills and wondering if he's doing enough to honor his father's legacy." Emma felt a flutter of something that might have been sympathy, or understanding, or something more complicated that she wasn't ready to examine too closely. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Maria's eyes twinkled with something that looked suspiciously like matchmaking mischief. "Because you're not from around here. You're not looking at him like he's a prize bull at auction. You're looking at him like he's a man who might understand what it's like to carry the weight of other people's expectations. Before Emma could respond to that observation, the sound of truck engines and male voices outside announced that Jake had returned with help to move Theodore. Through the kitchen window, Emma could see 3 men clustered around her truck, examining the bull calf with the professional interest of people who knew quality livestock when they saw it. "That's Carlos and Miguel," Maria said, following her gaze. "Brothers, been working here for 8 years. And the tall one with the beard is Sam Tucker, Jake's right-hand man. Good men, all of them, but they'll want to know everything about you and that calf before the day's out." Emma felt a familiar flutter of nervousness. Meeting new people, especially in a professional context, had always been challenging for her. David had often criticized her for being too quiet, too serious, not charming enough for the social aspects of ranching. But here, watching these men handle Theodore with obvious competence and respect, she felt something different. Not the judgment she'd come to expect, but genuine curiosity about her expertise. "Finish your soup," Maria instructed. "Then we'll get you cleaned up before Jake starts showing you around. First impressions matter, but second impressions matter more." 20 minutes later, Emma stood in the guest bathroom, staring at her reflection and trying to transform herself from exhausted refugee to competent livestock specialist. The hot water had helped, washing away the grime and fatigue of the road, and Maria had somehow produced clean clothes that fit reasonably well. Jeans that were only slightly too long, a work shirt that didn't gap across her chest, boots that would do until she could retrieve her own from the truck. Better, she told her reflection, pulling her damp hair back into a neat ponytail and trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. When she emerged from the bathroom, she found Jake waiting in the living room, Mason on his shoulders, and a smile on his weathered face that transformed his entire appearance. The serious, cautious rancher had been replaced by someone younger, more approachable. Someone who clearly enjoyed the uncomplicated enthusiasm of a 3-year-old. "Horsey ride," Mason announced gleefully, his small hands tangled in Jake's hair. "Mason," Emma said quickly, mortified. "Get down right now. Mr. Morrison isn't a jungle gym." "Actually, it's Jake," he said, lifting Mason down but keeping one hand on the toddler's shoulder. "And he's fine. Been a while since we had young ones around here." Emma felt heat rise to her cheeks. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of. Mason becoming a distraction, an imposition, something that would remind Jake of all the complications that came with hiring a single mother. "I'm sorry," she began, but Jake held up a hand to stop her. "Don't apologize for him being a kid," he said simply. "There'll be boundaries, rules to keep him safe around the animals and equipment. But this ranch has always been a place where children could learn and grow. My grandfather would roll over in his grave if we turned away the next generation." Emma felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. Maybe, just maybe, this could actually work. "Ready for that tour?" Jake asked. "More than ready," Emma replied, and for the first time since arriving at Riverside Ranch, she truly meant it. As they walked outside, Mason holding tightly to Emma's hand and chattering excitedly about the horses he could see in the distance, Emma caught sight of Theodore in his temporary pen. The bull calf looked calm and alert, already investigating his new surroundings with the intelligent curiosity that had first caught her attention as a potential investment. "He's settling in well," Jake observed, following her gaze. "Theodore's adaptable," Emma said. "Good thing, considering how much his life has changed lately." Jake glanced at her, and she had the distinct impression that he understood she wasn't just talking about the calf. "Sometimes change is exactly what we need," he said quietly, "even when we don't realize it at the time." As they walked toward the barn, Emma felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. Maybe Jake was right. Maybe change, even the difficult, frightening kind that had brought her here, was exactly what she and Mason needed. Maybe Riverside Ranch could be more than just a job, more than just a temporary refuge. Maybe it could be the beginning of something entirely new. The morning sun was just beginning to paint the Montana sky in shades of pink and gold, when Emma's alarm clock shattered the peaceful silence of the foreman's cottage. 3 weeks had passed since her arrival at Riverside Ranch, and the routine she'd established felt both foreign and familiar. Mason stirred in his small bed across the room, mumbling something about horses in his sleep before settling back into his dreams. Emma dressed quietly in the pre-dawn darkness, pulling on work boots that had finally begun to feel comfortable and a jacket that smelled faintly of hay and cattle. The cottage Jake had provided was modest, but perfect for their needs. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with windows that looked out over the rolling pastures, and a living area where Mason's toys had slowly begun to claim territory alongside her veterinary journals and breeding charts. Outside, the ranch was already stirring to life. She could hear the low murmur of voices from the main barn, the soft nickering of horses anticipating their morning feed, and somewhere in the distance, the gentle lowing of cattle greeting the day. These sounds had become her morning symphony, replacing the traffic noise and urban chaos she'd grown accustomed to in Colorado. Theodore's pen was her first stop, as it had been every morning since their arrival. The bull calf had grown noticeably in just 3 weeks, his frame filling out and his coat taking on the lustrous sheen that spoke of proper nutrition and care. He lifted his massive head as she approached, his dark eyes bright with intelligence, and what she could have sworn was affection. "Good morning, handsome," she murmured, running her hand along his neck and checking him over with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years learning to read the subtle signs of health and contentment in livestock. Theodore leaned into her touch, a gesture that never failed to remind her why she'd fallen in love with cattle genetics in the first place. "You're up early." Emma turned to find Jake approaching through the morning mist, 2 steaming cups of coffee in his hands and that slight smile she'd begun to recognize as his version of good humor. He'd shed some of the formal wariness that had marked their first meeting, though she caught him watching her work with an intensity that made her self-conscious. "Old habits," she said, accepting the coffee gratefully. David always said the early hours were when you could really see what the animals needed, before the day got complicated. Jake's expression tightened almost imperceptibly at the mention of her ex-husband, something Emma had noticed happened whenever she referenced her past life. She'd learned to keep those references brief, focusing instead on the technical knowledge that had brought her here, rather than the personal history that had driven her away. "Speaking of what they need," Jake said, gesturing toward Theodore, "I've been thinking about your breeding program proposal. The genetic diversity charts you showed me last week, the projected improvements in calf survival rates." Emma felt her pulse quicken. She'd spent countless hours preparing that presentation, documenting how Theodore's bloodlines could enhance the ranch's existing cattle stock, increase market value, and establish Riverside Ranch as a serious player in premium breeding circles. It represented everything she knew about genetics, nutrition, and cattle behavior, distilled into a comprehensive plan for the ranch's future. "The board meets next week," Jake continued, his tone carefully neutral. "My father always made the major decisions alone, but I believe in getting input from the other stakeholders. They'll want to hear your ideas directly." Emma's stomach clenched with familiar anxiety. Presenting to a board of established ranchers, defending her theories and projections to men who'd probably been working with cattle since before she was born, felt like walking into a lion's den. But it was also exactly the kind of opportunity she'd been hoping for. "How many board members?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "5, including myself. Tom Patterson owns the spread to our east, been in cattle for 40 years. Margaret Sullivan runs the largest breeding operation in 3 counties. Doc Henderson handles veterinary oversight for most of the ranches in the region, and Robert Martinez represents the financial interests." Emma nodded, mentally cataloging what she knew about each name. Patterson she'd heard mentioned as old school, traditional in his methods but fair in his dealings. Sullivan was legendary in breeding circles, one of the few women who'd built a reputation based purely on results. Henderson she'd met briefly when he'd stopped by to check on some of the ranch's horses, and he'd seemed impressed by her credentials. Martinez was an unknown quantity. "What's your read on them?" she asked. "Honestly." Jake considered the question, sipping his coffee while he weighed his words. "Tom's going to question any change that costs money up front, even if the long-term benefits are clear. Margaret will be your biggest ally if she believes in your science, but she doesn't suffer fools or half measures. Doc Henderson respects expertise, but he'll want to see practical applications, not just theoretical improvements. And Robert," he paused, his expression growing more serious, "Robert thinks I'm too young to be running this ranch, too willing to take risks that my father wouldn't have considered. He'll be looking for reasons to doubt your proposals, not because he has anything against you personally, but because approving them would validate my leadership. Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Her success or failure would reflect directly on Jake's ability to make sound decisions for the ranch. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a familiar burden. "No pressure, then," she said with a weak attempt at humor. Jake's smile was more genuine this time. "Emma, I've watched you work for 3 weeks. I've seen how you handle the cattle, how you've improved feed efficiency just by adjusting the ratios and timing. I've watched you analyze bloodlines and predict outcomes with accuracy that would make seasoned geneticists envious. If anyone can convince that board, it's you." The confidence in his voice stirred something warm in Emma's chest, a feeling she'd almost forgotten existed. David had rarely praised her work, treating her expertise as a useful hobby rather than a professional asset. To hear Jake speak of her abilities with such respect, such certainty, felt like validation she'd been craving for years. "There's something else," Jake said, his tone shifting to something more personal. "Mason." Emma's warm feelings evaporated instantly, replaced by the cold fear that had haunted her since arriving at the ranch. She'd known this conversation was coming, had dreaded it, even as she'd hoped it might never arrive. "What about Mason?" she asked, though she was afraid she already knew. "He's been spending a lot of time around the ranch operations," Jake said carefully. "Following the hands around, asking questions about the animals, trying to help with chores that are way too big for him." Emma closed her eyes, imagining her son getting in the way, creating safety hazards, being the kind of distraction that would justify sending them both away. "I'll talk to him," she said quickly. "I can arrange for childcare in town, maybe find a daycare that—" "Emma." Jake's voice stopped her spiral of panic. "That's not what I'm saying." She opened her eyes to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "The men have taken to him," Jake continued. "Carlos has been teaching him basic rope knots. Miguel showed him how to identify different cattle breeds. Sam's been letting him help distribute feed, carrying the small buckets and counting the animals." Emma blinked, confusion replacing fear. "They have?" "They have. And more importantly, Mason's been learning. Real learning, not just playing around. Yesterday I watched him correctly identify 3 different breeds of cattle and explain why the Angus cows needed different feed than the Herefords." Emma stared at Jake, hardly believing what she was hearing. Mason had always been bright, curious about everything around him, but she'd never imagined that a 3-year-old could absorb that kind of technical information. "He's got an eye for it," Jake said simply. "The same instincts I see in you when you're working with the cattle. It's not something that can be taught, Emma. It's something you're born with." Emma felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. David had often complained that Mason was too young, too energetic, too much work for a serious ranching operation. To hear Jake speak of her son's potential, his natural abilities, felt like a gift she'd never expected to receive. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I'm saying that maybe Mason belongs here as much as you do," Jake replied. "I'm saying that this ranch has always been about family, about passing knowledge from one generation to the next, and I'm saying that if you want it, if you think it's right for him, Mason could learn things here that no school could ever teach him." Emma looked out over the pastures, where she could see cattle grazing peacefully in the morning light, where Theodore stood proud and strong in his pen, where her son had apparently found acceptance and purpose in ways she'd never dared to hope for. "The board meeting," she said, bringing the conversation back to more immediate concerns. "What if they don't approve the breeding program? What if they think it's too risky, too expensive?" Jake's expression grew serious again. "Then we'll have to reassess. But Emma, I believe in what you're proposing. More than that, I believe in you. Whatever happens with the board, that's not going to change." Before Emma could respond, the sound of a truck engine drawing near caught their attention. A dust cloud was approaching down the ranch road, moving faster than the usual pace of morning deliveries or routine visits. "Expecting anyone?" Emma asked. Jake shook his head, his expression growing wary. "Too early for deliveries, and everyone who works here is already on the grounds." The truck pulled to a stop near the main house, and Emma felt her blood turn to ice as she recognized the Colorado license plates, the expensive paint job, the aggressive stance of the vehicle that had once sat in her own driveway. David Chen stepped out of the truck, his perfectly pressed clothes and city slicker boots looking out of place against the rustic backdrop of the ranch. Even from a distance, Emma could see the anger in his posture, the determined set of his shoulders that she remembered all too well from their worst fights. "Emma!" David's voice carried across the ranch yard, sharp with authority and barely contained fury. "I know you're here. We need to talk." Emma's coffee cup slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against the ground and sending hot liquid splashing across her boots. 3 weeks of peace, of building something new, of hope for the future, and now her past had found her. "Who is that?" Jake asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "David," Emma whispered, the name tasting like ashes in her mouth. "My ex-husband." Jake's expression hardened, his easy morning demeanor replaced by something colder, more protective. "What does he want?" "I don't know," Emma said, but that was a lie. David never traveled anywhere without a purpose, never expended effort without expecting significant returns. If he'd driven from Colorado to Montana, if he'd somehow tracked her to Riverside Ranch, it was because he wanted something important enough to justify the time and expense. "Emma," David called again, his voice closer now as he strode toward the barn area. "Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." "Stay here," Jake said quietly, his hand touching Emma's arm with gentle reassurance. "Let me handle this." "No," Emma said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "This is my problem, my responsibility. I won't hide behind you, Jake. Not from him." Jake studied her face for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Then we'll handle it together. But Emma, this is my ranch, my property. He doesn't get to come here and make demands or cause trouble." Emma felt a flutter of gratitude mixed with anxiety. Having Jake's support meant everything. But she also knew how charming David could be when he wanted something, how skillfully he could manipulate situations to his advantage. They walked toward the main house, Emma's legs feeling unsteady beneath her. David saw them coming and planted himself in their path, his expensive boots spread wide in a stance that proclaimed ownership and dominance. "There you are," David said, his tone deceptively casual despite the underlying steel. "You're looking well, Emma. Ranch life seems to agree with you." "What do you want, David?" Emma asked, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the way her heart was hammering against her ribs. David's gaze shifted to Jake, taking in his work clothes, his protective posture, the way he stood slightly in front of Emma like a shield. "And you must be the local yokel she's been playing house with?" "David Chen, Emma's husband." "Ex-husband," Emma corrected sharply. "And this is Jake Morrison, my employer." "Employer," David repeated, his tone making the word sound vaguely obscene. "Is that what we're calling it these days?" Jake stepped forward, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being respected on his own land. "Mr. Chen, you're on private property. If you have business with Emma, you can conduct it civilly, or you can leave." David's smile was sharp, predatory. "Oh, I have business, all right. Legal business. You see, there's been a development in our custody arrangement." Emma felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "What are you talking about?" "The custody agreement is final. Mason stays with me." "Agreements can be modified," David said, pulling a folded document from his jacket pocket. "Especially when circumstances change, when it becomes clear that a child is being raised in an unstable environment." Emma's hands shook as she took the papers, her eyes scanning the legal language that seemed to swim on the page. "You can't do this. Mason is happy here. He's thriving." "Is he?" David's voice was silky with false concern. "Living in a one-room shack, exposed to dangerous animals, no proper schooling or social interaction with children his age? What judge do you think would consider that in the child's best interests?" "It's a 2-bedroom cottage," Jake said quietly, but his tone carried warning. "And Mason is learning skills and gaining experiences that most children never have the opportunity to access." David laughed, the sound harsh and dismissive. "Skills like what? Shoveling manure? Dodging cattle hooves?" Emma always did put her obsession with animals ahead of practical concerns. Emma felt anger beginning to burn through her fear, the protective fury of a mother whose child was being threatened. Mason is learning about responsibility, about caring for living creatures, about the value of hard work. things you never bothered to teach him because you were too busy with your accountant. David's mask of civility slipped for just a moment, revealing the anger beneath. Careful, Emma. Personal attacks won't help your case when this goes to court. Court? Emma whispered. I'm filing for modification of custody, David said, his voice becoming businesslike again. Full custody, based on your inability to provide a stable home environment. My lawyers are confident we'll prevail. Emma felt the papers crumple in her grip as her hands clenched involuntarily. Everything she'd fought for, everything she'd built, everything that had started to feel like hope was being threatened by the man who'd already taken so much from her. On what grounds? She demanded. I have a job, a place to live. Mason is healthy and happy. On the grounds that you're living unmarried with a man you barely know, exposing our son to inappropriate situations, David replied smoothly. On the grounds that you're so obsessed with that bull calf that you're neglecting Mason's basic needs. On the grounds that you've isolated him from proper educational and social opportunities. Emma's vision blurred with tears of rage and frustration. Every accusation was a twisted version of the truth, designed to make her choices sound reckless and selfish. She could already imagine how it would sound in a courtroom, how a judge might view her decision to bring Mason to a working ranch. Those are lies, she said, but her voice lacked conviction even to her own ears. Are they? David asked. Where is Mason right now, Emma? While you're out here playing with cattle, where is our 3-year-old son? Emma's blood turned to ice as she realized she didn't have an immediate answer. Mason had been sleeping when she'd left the cottage for her morning rounds. She'd planned to check on him after finishing with Theodore, but David's unexpected arrival had disrupted her routine. He's sleeping, she said, but David was already shaking his head. No, Emma, he's not. Emma felt the world start to spin as David pointed toward the main barn, where a small figure had just emerged from the shadows. Mason, dressed in miniature work clothes that someone had obviously provided for him, was carefully carrying a bucket that was far too large for his small frame, his face serious with concentration as he followed Carlos toward the cattle pens. There's our son, David said with satisfaction, working like a common ranch hand instead of playing with toys or learning his letters like other children his age. Emma watched Mason struggle with the bucket, saw the way Carlos stayed close to help without making the boy feel incompetent, witnessed the pride on her son's face as he successfully completed his small task. To her, it was beautiful, a child learning responsibility and finding his place in a community that valued his contributions. But she could see how it would look to an outside observer, to a judge who didn't understand ranch life. A toddler doing manual labor, unsupervised and potentially in danger, while his mother prioritized livestock over childcare. Mason loves what he's learning here, Emma said desperately. He's happy, David. Happier than he ever was in Colorado. Happiness isn't the legal standard for custody decisions, David replied coldly. Safety is, stability is, and from what I can see, you're providing neither. Jake had been silent throughout this exchange, but now he stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of controlled anger. Mr. Chen, I think you've said enough. Emma is an exemplary employee and mother. Mason is safe, supervised, and learning valuable life skills. If you have legal business to conduct, you can do it through proper channels with appropriate representation. David's attention shifted to Jake with the focus of a predator identifying a threat. And what's your stake in this, Morrison? Besides the obvious benefits of having a woman desperate enough to work for probably half what you'd pay a man. Emma saw Jake's hands clench into fists and step between the two men before the situation could escalate further. Stop it, both of you. David, you've delivered your message. Now leave. Oh, I'm not going anywhere just yet, David said with false pleasantness. I think I'll stay in town for a few days, maybe observe Mason's living conditions more closely. For the court records, you understand. Emma felt trapped, cornered by legal threats and the horrible certainty that David held all the cards. He had money for lawyers, a stable home back in Colorado, and the ability to twist every aspect of her new life into evidence of her inadequacy as a mother. There's more, David continued, clearly enjoying her distress. I've done some research on your new boyfriend's operation here. Riverside Ranch isn't exactly thriving, is it? Financial difficulties, declining profits, questions about long-term viability. What happens to Mason when this place goes under and you're unemployed again? Emma's gaze flew to Jake, searching his face for denial, for reassurance that David's claims were exaggerated or false. Instead, she saw confirmation in the tight set of his jaw, the way his eyes avoided hers. "The ranch is fine," Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" David pulled out his phone, scrolling through what appeared to be financial data. "Because according to public records, you've been carrying significant debt for the past 2 years. Cattle prices have been declining, operational costs rising. Word in industry circles is that you're one bad season away from bankruptcy." Emma felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Not only was Mason's custody threatened, but the job and security she'd thought she'd found were apparently built on quicksand. "That's enough," Jake said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Get off my property, Chen. Now." "Or what?" David asked with amusement. "You'll call the sheriff? Go ahead. I'm sure they'd be very interested in hearing about the work conditions for minor children on this ranch." Emma saw Jake's restraint snap, saw him take a step toward David with violence clearly on his mind. Before he could make contact, she grabbed his arm, holding him back with desperate strength. "Don't," she whispered urgently. "It's exactly what he wants. Don't give him ammunition to use against us." Jake stopped, but his entire body remained coiled with tension, ready to spring. "Emma's right," he said finally. "You're not worth the legal complications." David straightened his jacket with theatrical precision. "Smart man. Now, Emma, about that custody modification. My lawyers will be in touch with a formal hearing date. I suggest you get legal representation, though I can't imagine how you'll afford it on a ranch hand salary." He started to turn away, then paused as if remembering something. "Oh, and Emma, I'll be taking Theodore back to Colorado with me." Emma's heart stopped. "What?" "The bull calf. My lawyers have determined that he's community property from our marriage, despite your claims otherwise. I'll be exercising my legal right to claim him as part of the divorce settlement." "No," Emma whispered, then louder. "No, Theodore is mine. The breeding rights, the registration papers, everything is in my name." "Papers can be challenged," David said with a shrug, "especially when they involve assets acquired during a marriage with community funds. Don't worry, I'll take good care of him. He'll be valuable breeding stock for my operation." Emma felt her world crumbling around her. Mason, Theodore, her job, her future, everything she'd fought for was being systematically destroyed by the man who'd already taken so much from her. "You can't do this," she said, but her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Watch me," David replied. He pulled out his phone and made a quick call. "This is Chen. I'm at the Morrison Ranch. Bring the trailer." Emma realized with growing horror that David hadn't come alone, that this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment visit but a carefully planned assault on everything she'd built. Within minutes, another truck appeared, this one pulling a livestock trailer designed for transporting cattle. "No," Emma said again, moving to stand between David and Theodore's pen. "I won't let you take him." "Emma, don't make this worse," David said, his voice carrying false sympathy. "Theodore will be better off in a proper facility, with adequate resources and professional management. Just like Mason will be better off in a stable home environment." Emma felt Jake's hand on her shoulder, grounding her, reminding her that she wasn't facing this alone. But even with his support, the weight of David's threats felt overwhelming. "There has to be another way," she said desperately. "Legal options, appeals, something." "There is," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying a note of determination that made both Emma and David look at him sharply. "What?" Emma asked. Jake was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving from Emma to Mason, who was still helping Carlos near the barn, oblivious to the drama unfolding. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, deliberate. "Marry me," he said simply. Emma's mouth fell open in shock. David laughed outright. "Excuse me," Emma whispered. "Marry me," Jake repeated, turning to face her fully. "Today, if possible." It eliminates the quote-quote living situation argument, provides Mason with a stable two-parent home, and gives you legal standing to fight for both Theodore and custody. Emma stared at him, hardly able to process what he was suggesting. Marriage to a man she'd known for 3 weeks, a legal union based on desperation rather than love, a solution that felt both like salvation and another kind of trap. "That's insane," David said, but Emma could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. "A marriage of convenience won't fool any judge." "Won't it?" Jake asked, his tone mild but his eyes hard. "Emma and I have been living and working together, building a life together, making plans for the future. Mason has been thriving in our care. What judge wouldn't see that as a stable family unit?" Emma's mind raced through the implications. Marriage would indeed change the legal landscape, might provide the stability and respectability that David was using as weapons against her. But it would also tie her to Jake in ways she wasn't sure she was ready for, create obligations and expectations that went far beyond their professional relationship. "Emma?" Jake said quietly, his hand still on her shoulder. "I know this isn't how these things usually happen, but sometimes extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary solutions." Emma looked at him, this man who'd given her a chance when no one else would, who'd welcomed Mason into the ranch community, who was now willing to legally bind himself to her problems in order to help her fight them. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this?" Jake's expression softened slightly. "Because you and Mason belong here. Because Theodore represents the future of this ranch. Because David Chin has no right to destroy what we've been building." David stepped forward, his composure finally cracking. "This is ridiculous. You can't just manufacture a marriage to avoid legal consequences." "Can't I?" Jake asked. "Emma, what do you say?" Emma looked around at the ranch that had become home, at Mason, who was running toward them with a smile on his face, at Theodore, who represented everything she'd sacrificed to build a better future. Then she looked at David, whose confident smile was beginning to waver as he realized his carefully laid plans might not be as foolproof as he'd believed. "Yes," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Yes, Jake Morrison, I'll marry you." David's face flushed with anger. "This won't work, Emma. No judge will be fooled by an obvious sham marriage." "Then we'll make sure it's not a sham," Jake said simply. As Mason reached them, his small face bright with innocent joy, Emma felt something shift inside her. Maybe this marriage would start as a legal strategy. But as she watched Jake lift her son into his arms with genuine affection, as she saw the way Mason's face lit up with trust and happiness, she realized that perhaps extraordinary circumstances really did require extraordinary solutions. And perhaps, just perhaps, this solution might become something more than either of them had dared to imagine. The sound of David's frustrated curse carried across the ranch yard as he realized his carefully planned victory was slipping away. But Emma was no longer listening to his threats. Instead, she was watching Jake and Mason, seeing the beginning of something that might actually be worth fighting for. The courthouse in Helena buzzed with its usual morning activity as Emma adjusted Mason's tiny bow tie for the third time in 5 minutes. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed down his hair, trying to project calm while her heart hammered against her ribs. 2 days had passed since Jake's proposal. 2 days of frantic planning and legal maneuvering that had left her feeling like she was living someone else's life. Judge Patricia Hawkins had agreed to perform the ceremony in her chambers, a small mercy that would keep their hastily arranged wedding out of the public eye. Emma wore a simple blue dress that Maria had helped her select from the limited options at the local department store, while Jake stood beside her in his best suit, looking as nervous as she felt. David had made good on his threat to stay in town, taking up residence at the local motel and making his presence known at every opportunity. His lawyers had already filed emergency motions challenging the upcoming marriage, claiming it was a fraudulent attempt to circumvent custody laws. But Emma's attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Wells, whom Jake had somehow managed to hire within hours of their decision, seemed confident they could weather the legal storm. "The documentation is solid," Catherine had assured them during their meeting the previous evening. "Your employment history, the progression of your relationship, Mason's integration into ranch life, it all supports the narrative of a natural evolution from professional partnership to personal commitment." Now, standing in the judge's chambers with Mason's small hand in hers and Jake's steady presence beside her, Emma wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life or the smartest decision she'd ever contemplated. Judge Hawkins entered with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who'd overseen hundreds of similar ceremonies. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes that seemed to see everything. Emma had heard she was fair but thorough. Exactly the kind of judge who wouldn't be easily fooled by a marriage of pure convenience. "Before we begin," Judge Hawkins said, settling behind her desk, "I want to be clear about something. Marriage is a legal contract with serious implications for all parties involved, including minor children. I have concerns about the timing of this ceremony, given the pending custody modification filed by Mr. Chen." Emma felt her stomach drop, but Jake stepped forward slightly. "Your Honor, with respect, Emma and I have been building a relationship for months. The timing may seem sudden to outside observers, but it reflects the natural progression of two people who've found they want to build a life together." Judge Hawkins studied him carefully. "Mr. Morrison, you're asking me to believe that you've decided to marry a woman you've known for less than a month, take on responsibility for her child, and involve yourself in a contentious custody battle, all out of love?" The silence stretched uncomfortably as Emma waited for Jake's response. She realized that she was holding her breath, that Mason was watching the adults with the confused attention of a child sensing important things he couldn't understand. "Your Honor," Jake said finally, his voice quiet but firm, "I'm asking you to recognize that sometimes life doesn't follow conventional timelines. Emma and Mason arrived at my ranch when we all needed each other most. She's brought expertise that's already improving our operation, and Mason has brought joy and energy that the place had been missing for years." He paused, glancing at Emma with an expression that made her heart skip unexpectedly. "But more than that, they've brought hope. Hope for the future, for growth, for becoming something better than we were separately. If that's not worth making a commitment to, I don't know what is." Judge Hawkins listened with the attention of someone weighing every word. "And you, Ms. Chen? Are you entering this marriage freely, without coercion or undue pressure from your circumstances?" Emma looked down at Mason, who was now playing with a small toy horse in his pocket, then at Jake, whose steady gaze gave her courage she hadn't known she possessed. "I am, Your Honor. Jake has shown me and my son kindness, respect, and genuine care. He's offered us not just legal protection, but a true partnership in building something meaningful together." The judge made notes on the papers before her, then looked up with an expression Emma couldn't read. "Very well, but understand this. If I discover that this marriage is a sham designed to manipulate custody proceedings, there will be serious legal consequences for all parties involved." Emma nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Beside her, Jake straightened his shoulders in a gesture she'd come to recognize as his way of accepting responsibility. The ceremony itself was brief and businesslike. Judge Hawkins read the required words, asked for their vows, and witnessed their signatures on documents that would legally bind them together. When Jake slipped a simple gold band on Emma's finger, a ring he'd somehow managed to procure in the frantic 2 days of preparation, she felt the weight of commitment settle around her like a mantle. "You may kiss the bride," Judge Hawkins said with the faintest hint of warmth creeping into her professional demeanor. Jake's kiss was gentle, brief, appropriate for the formal setting. But Emma felt something in that simple contact, a promise of protection and partnership that made her believe, for the first time since David's arrival, that everything might actually work out. "Mama married Jake," Mason announced with 3-year-old delight, clapping his hands together. Judge Hawkins smiled at that, the first genuine warmth she'd shown during the proceedings. "Indeed he did, young man. And now Jake is part of your family." As they left the courthouse, Emma felt the weight of her new status settling over her. She was Mrs. Morrison now, legally bound to a man she was still learning to trust, committed to a life she was still figuring out how to navigate. David was waiting outside, his expensive suit and predatory smile, a stark contrast to the casual friendliness of the other people moving through downtown Helena. He'd brought his lawyers with him, a team of sharp-dressed professionals who looked like they'd stepped out of a corporate boardroom. "Congratulations," David said, his tone making the words sound like an insult. "Though I have to wonder what the happy couple will do when this little charade falls apart." Catherine Wells stepped forward before Emma could respond. "Mr. Chen, your objections have been noted and will be addressed through proper legal channels. For now, I suggest you allow the newlyweds to enjoy their wedding day." David's lead attorney, a thin man with predatory eyes, spoke up. "We'll be filing additional motions based on this obvious attempt to circumvent legal proceedings." No judge will be fooled by such a transparent manipulation. Perhaps, Catherine replied calmly, but until those motions are heard and decided, Mr. and Mrs. Morrison have every legal right to their privacy and their family life. Emma felt Jake's hand find hers, warm and steady despite the tension crackling in the air around them. Mason pressed close to her other side, his small face serious, as he watched the adults engage in their incomprehensible grown-up conflict. "This isn't over, Emma," David said, his mask of civility slipping to reveal the anger beneath. "Marriage, or no marriage, I'm not giving up my son or my property." "Theodore isn't your property," Emma said, finding her voice at last. "And Mason deserves better than being treated like a possession to be won or lost." David's smile was sharp and cold. We'll see what the court says about that. As he and his legal team departed, Emma felt some of the tension leave her shoulders, but she knew David was right about one thing. This was far from over. The legal battles would continue, the custody challenges would persist, and her new marriage would be scrutinized by courts and community members alike. "Come on," Jake said quietly, his hand still holding hers. "Let's go home." Home! The word sounded strange and wonderful in the context of their new reality. Emma looked down at the gold ring on her finger, at Mason, who was now chattering excitedly about the big important building where Mama had gotten married, at Jake, whose steady presence had become her anchor in the storm of uncertainty. The drive back to Riverside Ranch was quiet, filled with the weight of what they'd just committed to and the knowledge that their real work was just beginning. As they pulled into the familiar ranch road, Emma saw Maria standing on the front porch of the main house, her weathered face creased with the kind of smile that spoke of genuine joy. "Felicidades!" Maria called out as they approached, her arms open wide to embrace them all. "Welcome home, Mrs. Morrison!" Emma felt tears prick at her eyes at the warmth in the older woman's voice, the acceptance and celebration that felt so different from the legal maneuvering and hostile confrontations of the morning. "We're having a proper celebration tonight," Maria announced, brooking no argument. "The whole crew will be here, and I've been cooking all day." A wedding feast worthy of the occasion. Emma started to protest that it wasn't necessary, that they didn't want to make a big deal of what was essentially a legal arrangement, but Jake squeezed her hand gently. "Maria's been planning this since we told her yesterday," he said with a smile. Fighting her now would be like trying to rope the wind. As the afternoon progressed, Emma found herself swept up in preparations she hadn't expected and didn't feel worthy of. Maria had transformed the ranch house into something magical, with wildflowers from the meadows arranged in mason jars, strings of lights hung from the porch rafters, and the scent of amazing food wafting from the kitchen. The ranch hands arrived as the sun began to set, all of them cleaned up and wearing their best clothes. Carlos and Miguel had even convinced Mason to wear a miniature cowboy hat that made him look like a tiny version of the men he'd been learning from. Sam Tucker presented Emma with a bouquet of prairie flowers he'd picked himself, his weathered face bashful but sincere. "Welcome to the family, Mrs. Morrison," he said simply, and Emma realized that this was more than just a celebration of her marriage to Jake. This was the ranch community's way of officially accepting her and Mason as permanent members of their extended family. As the evening wore on, Emma found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't since David's unexpected arrival. She watched Mason run around with the patient supervision of men who'd clearly appointed themselves his unofficial guardians. She listened to stories about the ranch's history, the challenges they'd faced together, the hopes they had for the future, and she watched Jake, seeing him in his element as the leader of this tight-knit community, understanding for the first time the full weight of responsibility he carried on his shoulders. "You're quiet," he said, joining her on the porch as the party continued around them. "Just thinking," Emma replied, looking out over the darkening landscape that had become home in ways she was still learning to appreciate. "Having second thoughts." Emma considered the question seriously. The marriage was still new, still strange, still built on necessity, rather than the kind of deep emotional connection she'd once believed was essential. But watching Mason laugh with genuine happiness, seeing the way the ranch community had embraced them both, feeling the solid reliability of Jake's presence beside her, she realized that maybe there were different kinds of foundations for building a life together. "No," she said finally, "no second thoughts. But Jake, we need to talk about what this means, what our expectations are, how we're going to make this work for both of us." Jake nodded, his expression serious. "You're right. We rushed into this for all the right reasons, but we still need to figure out the practical details. The sleeping arrangements, Emma said, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. Mason and I can stay in the cottage, or we can find other accommodations that don't complicate things for you. Emma, Jake said gently, you're my wife now. That cottage is your home, for as long as you want it to be. We don't have to change anything that makes you uncomfortable, but we also don't have to pretend this is something it's not. Emma looked at him, this man who'd married her to protect her child and her dreams, who'd opened his home and his community to them without asking for anything in return except the chance to build something better together. What do you want this to be, Jake? She asked quietly. Jake was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains that ring the valley. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but certain. I want it to be real, he said. Maybe it didn't start the way most marriages do, but I want it to grow into something genuine, something built on respect and partnership, and shared dreams for the future. Emma felt something warm unfurl in her chest, a possibility she'd been afraid to acknowledge even to herself. I want that too, she whispered. As if summoned by their quiet conversation, Mason appeared at Emma's side, his small face sleepy but content as he leaned against her leg. Mama, are we staying here forever now? He asked, with the directness of a child who needed certainty in an uncertain world. Emma looked at Jake, seeing her own hopes reflected in his steady gaze. Yes, sweetheart, she said, lifting Mason into her arms. We're staying here forever now. Good, Mason said with satisfaction, already half asleep against her shoulder. I like it here. I like Jake. And Theodore likes his new pen. Emma laughed softly, amazed by her son's ability to distill complex adult situations into simple truths. Maybe that was the key to making this work, focusing on the simple truths rather than the complicated fears. As the celebration continued around them and the Montana stars appeared in the darkening sky above, Emma Morrison held her son close and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, like she was exactly where she belonged. The legal battles with David would continue. The challenges of building a marriage on unconventional foundations would test them both, and the work of proving themselves as a family would require patience and commitment from everyone involved. But tonight, surrounded by people who'd chosen to welcome them, protected by laws that recognized their union, and grounded by the steady presence of a man who'd been willing to risk everything to keep them safe, Emma finally understood what Jake had meant about extraordinary circumstances requiring extraordinary solutions. Sometimes the best families weren't the ones you were born into, but the ones you chose to build together. And sometimes the most important promises weren't the ones made in moments of passion, but the ones made in moments of crisis, when everything that mattered was on the line. As Jake's hand found hers in the darkness, Emma Morrison smiled and began to believe that their extraordinary solution might just become the most ordinary kind of happiness after all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.